Okay, so today we're going to be talking about the Neo-Freudians. Neo, like that prefix meaning new, so like the new Freudians. Obviously, we're not going to be talking about Sigmund Freud anymore, but we're talking about the people who originally were part of Freud's like inner academic circle, and then towards the end of Freud's career, when his ideas fell a little bit out of favor, especially his overemphasis on like the sexual conflicts in our unconscious, you're going to see these psychologists begin to break away from Freud and really retain aspects of what he believed and like some of the foundations of psychoanalysis, but start to kind of expand on their own theories. So your very first term or phrase on page 6 of your note guide is Neo-Freudians. What I want you to kind of have here, and it might make sense to maybe do like a T-chart situation if you can, is what the theorists accepted about Freud and then kind of the ways that they differed. So when we talk about Neo-Freudians or psychodynamic theorists, they really agreed with Freud on the fundamentals of psychoanalysis. So we have, the importance of the unconscious. That is never going to go away. That is sort of the linchpin on which all Neo-Freudian and psychodynamic theories spin, is this, idea of the unconscious driving our personality. Almost all Neo-Freudians are also going to place incredible importance on childhood relationships and the importance of those early experiences in shaping personality. For the most part, they agreed with like this structure of the id, ego, superego. Some of the theorists kind of changed what aspects did what. For example, Carl Jung talked about a collective unconscious rather than Freud's more traditional unconscious. And most psychodynamic theorists also tend to accept like the role of defense mechanisms and, how defense mechanisms help to reduce anxiety. You will see, like if you just research defense mechanisms, you're going to get the ones that we talked about yesterday, but you're also going to see, a variety of other ones that get thrown in. So, that is kind of an evolving area where, other theorists have added other defense mechanisms and stuff like that. In terms of how psychodynamic theories differed from Sigmund Freud, the biggest, most fundamental shift is going to be away from the idea of sexual conflict in childhood. So, I have here some examples. Alfred Adler and Karen Horney believed that the conflict in our unconscious was social, that it had to do with our relationships with our parents and with our siblings and the people around us, and not sexual at all. Carl Jung, as I mentioned earlier, really focused on this idea of the collective unconscious and what he called the process of individuation as the driving force of personality rather than, again, those sexual conflicts. So in this case, like each one of the psychodynamic theorists is going to differ a little bit in terms of their theories, their research, but the main takeaway in terms of how they all differed from Sigmund Freud is in that like break away from what the conflict in our unconscious is, that it isn't, sexual in nature, that it's something else. These are some of your most famous Neo-Freudians. We will talk about each of them one by one, so you will get like the notes in your note guide here. But Carl Jung, Alfred Adler, and Karen Horney are largely considered like the most famous Neo-Freudians. You will find other ones. Anna Freud, Sigmund Freud's daughter, is a Neo-Freudian, and there's just other lesser known people who have some pretty wild ideas about the unconscious and about, personality. For our purposes, these are the three people that we are going to be focusing on in terms of how they differ. They are the ones that are most likely to pop up on the AP exam and most likely to pop up on a unit test, therefore. So we're going to start with Carl Jung, who is originally Sigmund Freud's closest colleague. He worked with Freud for many, many years, and, really spent a lot of time building up those foundations of what we know to be the psychoanalytic theory or the psychodynamic theory of psychology with him. It wasn't until much later in both of their careers that they began to disagree. So in terms of like what I would have written down for just Carl Jung, prominent neo-Freudian, one of Freud's closest colleagues for, a good number of years, helped to build the field of psychoanalysis. And then we can get into that disagreement. The disagreement with Carl Jung and Sigmund Freud comes over the idea of what the unconscious is. So Carl Jung had this idea that our unconscious, and we'll talk about the collective unconscious, I'll give you a specific definition on the next slide, was this process, it was like a reservoir of collected memories that the entire world shared. And that, as you see written here, it was a source of creativity and insight. And he believed that, we are all born with this unconscious set of memories, and all humans have them. And, our building our personality is the process of what he called individuation. Finding out your separate self from the unconscious and figuring out how you're different from, these collectively unconscious memories. And his main theory, or his main idea for why the collective unconscious exists, really does focus on the creative works. It focuses on paintings, literary works, poems, things like that. And this idea that regardless of a culture, regardless of whether or not cultures interacted, you tend to see the same things pop up in cultural myths. And he created what we now call archetypes, which if you are in AP English or AP Language, you probably talk about archetypes a lot because it is a very common literary device where you have, the archetype of the damsel in distress and the white knight and the evil witch, and, the court jester. And all of those ideas came from from Jung, and specifically this idea that, these archetypes lived in our collective unconscious. And when people from different societies, again, in geographically distant locations across time, went to write stories and myths, they unconsciously pulled from these archetypes, which is why you can find so many commonalities among, Norse mythology and Greek mythology and Egyptian mythology. Why do all of these disparate cultures have similar creation myths and similar types of gods and, just similar stories? And Jung believed that that was all evidence of the collective unconscious. So in terms of a definition, the collective unconscious is this idea that all humans have a reservoir of shared unconscious memories, that, again, the key here being unconscious. We're not aware of what these collective memories are that we share with everybody, but we have them, and we unconsciously pull from them in our everyday lives. We pull from them in determining how we should act. Am I going to be the white knight? Am I going to be... Sorry, I got interrupted there for a second. But anyway, the creation of our personality comes partially from the collective unconscious. Am I going to be the white knight? Am I going to be the damsel in distress? Am I going to be the wicked stepmother? And there's all kinds of archetypes. And the process through which we create that personality, again, is called individuation. So according to Jung, individuation is the process through which our personality develops. And during this process, as we're growing up, basically we're integrating parts of our personal unconscious, so our personal stored set of unconscious memories, and pieces from the collective unconscious, the shared unconscious that the entire world has, and we're integrating those two things together to create, the individual. So that's where we get individuation. So again, it's the integration of aspects of my personal unconscious and my collective unconscious kind of coming together. like Freud, excuse me, like Freud had this process of fixation in the psychosexual stages, Carl Jung also has this idea that if there is an improper integration or improper, unity between the collective unconscious and the personal unconscious, then you could have psychological problems. That's where a lot of mental health issues come from, is something went wrong in this process of de-individuation. You do not have a line for the Jungian archetypes, and so you don't necessarily need to take these down, but I do want to show you the 4 archetypes that Carl Jung created. And then again, like that, this is now like a literary device that, we use to kind of understand novels and poems and things like that. Especially as a way to kind of break down like character analysis. So I'm going to pause here and go to a website that just kind of runs through them real quick. So the first Jungian archetype is the persona, and the persona is how we present ourselves to the world. So according to Jung, this would be like our social mask. So the idea, I've often talked about like how my personality changes and how all of our personality changes from situation to situation. I often refer to myself as either teacher Megan or weekend Megan. Weekend Megan is very introverted. She doesn't like to talk a whole lot. She doesn't like to be in big groups. It's very different from like the animated, kind of has to be extroverted, has to kind of like, do all of these things that teacher Megan has. So that teacher Megan could be considered like my persona. And so this idea of it throughout childhood, learning to behave in certain ways based on certain situations is developing like all of these different personas. Your student persona, your friend persona, your, son or daughter persona, etc. The next one is the shadow self. This is where all of those like uncomfortable pieces live. So, he didn't totally disagree that like we are motivated by like unacceptable thoughts and wishes, but he thought they all kind of were confined to this archetype known as the shadow self. So that's where, your sexual instincts are going to be. That's where your aggressive instincts are, your desires, your weaknesses, your shortcomings, all of these parts that we don't like about ourselves or we don't want to show to people, like Freud, he believed in dream analysis. So if you're kind of looking down here and reading this part, he believed that our shadow self would show up in like dreams, daydreams, stuff like that, and would take on very specific symbolic forms that then you could use to like analyze your dreams or analyze, what was going on in your unconscious. The anima and animus, this is dependent on whether or not you are male or female, and that's just biologically speaking. Again, we are operating in a time period where the concept of gender identity being different from biological sex, like that just was not a thing. So you were either, male or female, and that was it. It was completely binary. And so in this case, the anima is the feminine side of a male, and the animus is the masculine side of a female. So it's all of the like gender roles, gender identity, things that we talk about today kind of rolled up into this particular archetype. And, how we are encouraged to adapt to those specific roles, if you will. And then lastly, you have the self, which is essentially like who you actually are. And this is what you create through that process of individuation, where you integrate all these various parts of your personality into, one consistent being. So once you've done that, you've created the self. And, again, problems with that de-individuation process are going to result in psychological issues, mental health problems, stuff like that. So those are the 4 major Jungian archetypes. Again, there are all kinds of other ones. These are other ones that Jung described himself. So you have the father, you have the mother, you have the child, the wise old man, the hero, the maiden, the trickster. And these, like, especially these last couple are definitely things that like are getting into that world of like the literary. In part of Freud's argument for the collective unconscious is this idea that, you can find a hero archetype in Beowulf and also in the Iliad and also in ancient Chinese works and ancient Native American works. And similarly, you can have the maiden and the trickster, and, they all pop up regardless of when these stories and myths were written. And then, as I've said a couple of times now, if you are into like literary analysis or anything like that, this whole concept of archetypes has kind of been built out into a very broad sort of character analysis tool that we use to look at various literary works. Okay, so I'm going to go back and talk about Alfred Adler and then Karen Horney and then updates to Freud, and then we're done. Okay, so Alfred Adler, another Neo-Freudian, in what you would write underneath his name would be this part here. He really focused on the social aspect and social conflict in the unconscious, especially this idea that what is driving our personality is a sense of inferiority. So if for Jung, what's driving our personality is the collective unconscious and these archetypes. And for Freud, the driving force behind our personality are these sexual conflicts. For Alfred Adler, it's really these social conflicts, especially our personal fight against feelings of inferiority. So he really focused on that theme, that inferiority is sort of the core of our personality. Again, like not particularly happy, most psychodynamic theorists and, Neo-Freudians and Freud, they all believe that our personality is being driven by something that is relatively like dark and, not particularly healthy, which is why we get this idea that, according to psychoanalysis, most of our personality is really kind of messed up, that we're all kind of sick in some way. So the key here is that inferiority. He is the first person to coin the term inferiority complex, which is a term that, again, has made its way into pop culture, is something that we still talk about. But it's basically this idea that we compare ourselves to those around us and find ourselves wanting. And then our personality is kind of defined by that inferiority complex. So for example, Alfred Adler really believed in the science of birth order, which again is something that kind of has carried over into pop psychology. So, if you have an older sibling who gets good grades and has friends and is outgoing and, is successful in their life, Alfred Adler would argue that the second child would have an inferiority complex when comparing themselves to their sibling. And they could go a couple of different ways. They could, on the one hand, become like the perfect child and try to outdo their sibling in everything, try to get slightly better grades and have, a couple more friends. And that success would be driven by their sense of inferiority towards their sibling. That second sibling could also just decide to rebel against the success of their sibling. They might decide to fail all their classes and become super deviant and, skip school and, do drugs and like all these other things that are very counter. And again, that behavior, according to Adler, is going to be driven by this sense of inferiority. Like, since I can't outdo my sibling, I'm not even going to try. I'm just going to go the complete opposite direction and become my, something totally different. And, Adler did believe that we would experience inferiority in pretty much all aspects of our lives, that we would compare ourselves to our friends, our significant others, our bosses, our colleagues. But the primary source of the inferiority complex for Adler comes from our relationships with our siblings, or in the case of like an only child, our lack of relationship with siblings. And that really kind of follows suit with this idea of the childhood playing such a major role in the development of a person's personality. So Adler is also really famous for his theory of birth order, which again, if you've ever talked about like, oh, you have such, middle child syndrome, or, you're clearly the baby of the family, or you've ever made comments like that, you are referring to Alfred Adler's theory of birth order, whether or not you realize that's what you're doing. And so birth order, generally speaking, is the study of how our birth affects our personality. And there's a lot of different pieces to it. So I am going to stop here and play a video on birth order because this is usually one that students have a particular interest in. So I'm going to pause here and go to that.
There's all kinds of stereotypes about what your position in your family says about you. Oldest kids are the most responsible. The ones in the middle are rebels, and since I'm the youngest, I must be spoiled. And sorry, only children. According to society, you're selfish. It's called birth order theory, and it might sound like an appealing way to explain why your older brother is so overbearing and competitive, or why your younger sister always has to get what she wants. But even though psychologists have used birth order theory to explain personality traits for decades, recent studies are finding that it doesn't actually seem to matter where you are in your family. The theory dates way back to 1908, the early days of psychology, when it was proposed by Austrian psychologist Alfred Adler, a buddy of famous psychoanalysts Freud and Jung. All three of them agreed that experiences a person had as a kid could have big impacts on their personality as an adult. Adler took it one step further and argued that a child's position in their family would have a big impact on their development because each kid would experience a different psychological environment. In his writings, he theorized that the firstborn child starts out as the spoiled only child that is basically dethroned when the next sibling comes along. After getting bumped, the oldest child ends up overbearing and neurotic since they feel responsible for looking after their younger siblings. Middleborn children, on the other hand, they're likely to feel overlooked and become the rebels of the family. And the youngest children might be babied by their parents, so according to Adler, they typically end up the most spoiled. Adler never used any scientific research to justify his theory, but he used it as a therapeutic tool when working with his clients anyway. As the idea became more popular, psychologists realized that they should probably do some actual research to find out if birth order theory was actually true. Personality is a complex thing to try and quantify, and it can change over time, but scientists have figured out a way to sort of measure personality using what's known as the 5-factor model, or just the Big Five. It's not so much a theory of personality as it is a way to categorize different traits on sliding scales. People can take a test to see where they fall on the scales of 5 traits: openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. Based on a handful of early studies, some psychologists are pretty convinced that you can connect birth order to specific Big Five traits. Like, oldest children are more conscientious and neurotic, while youngest children are more open to new experiences. And this approach is really appealing because it sounds totally plausible, right? Like, I have an older brother. He's pretty neurotic. But those earlier studies have a lot of flaws, and the more recent research with bigger, better designed studies hasn't found much of a connection between birth order and Big Five personality traits. One of the problems with those smaller studies was that they often depended on one sibling self-reporting their personalities and those of their siblings, like what I just did. So if the researchers were interviewing an oldest child, for example, the subject was more likely to report that they were more responsible, while their free-spirited little brother was more open. But the difference between the way someone sees themselves and how they see someone else can really affect the results of the survey. These studies had other flaws too. For instance, they mostly looked at the differences between siblings within the same family, and they interviewed everybody around the same time, which meant that the people born first were always older than the siblings they were being compared to. So if the researchers found that firstborns tended to be more responsible, was that because they were born first, or because people just tend to get more responsible as they get older? So even though some of those early studies did seem to find a link between birth order and personality, their flaws meant that the results weren't super reliable. Now, more recently, researchers have been using much bigger data sets to analyze differences in large groups of kids from multiple Western countries. And it turns out that once you start comparing traits across families and looking at more subjects, the effects tend to go away. In 2 huge studies published in 2015, scientists were able to compare tons of different kids across lots of different families. One of the studies looked at almost 400,000 U.S. high school students, and the other included over 20,000 students from the U.S., UK, and Germany. The one difference they found, and if you are an older sibling, I expect you to hold this over your younger siblings, was a small change in intellect, which is considered one of the subtraits of openness in the Big Five. Siblings born first tend to have a very slightly higher IQ than siblings born later. We're talking like couple of points. It could come from firstborn kids getting a little bit more direct attention from their parents at an early age. But as we've talked about before here on SciShow Psych, IQ is just a way to measure learning ability, and that's only one part of the complex concept of intelligence, and it can be affected by lots of different things like how motivated you are to do well on the test. And other studies looking at big sets of data haven't found an effect of birth order on IQ at all. Other than that, these gigantic studies found no significant effect of birth order on any of the other big 5 traits. So most psychologists treat birth order theory with a healthy amount of skepticism these days, although it hasn't been totally disregarded. Birth order might be an appealing way to explain differences in the behavior of siblings, but when you look across large groups of families, the effects just aren't there. You might know individual people who fit the stereotype of an oldest sibling who's more responsible or a youngest who seems spoiled, but there are also plenty of responsible youngest children or oldest children who act like total brats. Over time and across populations, those traits balance out. So birth order theory doesn't actually explain why your middle sister ran off to start a rock band. That's just because she's awesome. Thanks for watching this episode of SciShow Psych.
Okay, so the video also does mention the Big 5 trait theory of personality, which we will be covering after spring break. So that's something we will come back to that is a more scientific measure of personality. But basically, the takeaway here is that for the most part, birth order is something that has made its way into pop culture, like a lot of Freudian things. Again, the idea of the ego, the idea of being anal to mean you're organized, all kinds of things. But the science doesn't necessarily really back it up the way that we would like it to, even if it seems to make some kind of plausible sense. The last Neo-Freudian we are going to talk about is Karen Horney. And Karen Horney, so again, underneath her name, you can add this part here. Her major thing and what makes her super famous is her criticism of Freud in the way that he talked about and portrayed women. I've mentioned a couple of times, especially in the psychosexual stages theory, that Freud was a pretty intense misogynist. He didn't really think a whole lot of women. He thought that women were inferior to men and, unconsciously wished they were men. That's where that whole idea of penis envy kind of comes in, and Karen Horney, for many obvious and less obvious reasons, very much disagreed with that. So she definitely criticized Freud in that, and, highlighted a more feminist take on psychoanalysis, and then also came up with one of the most famous theories that we still talk about today, which would be the theory of neurotic needs. So very briefly, I'm going to take you to a website to talk a little bit about the neurotic needs. But Freud had this idea of penis envy, that women wish that they had a penis, and that's why some women, wanted to work outside of the household and get an education, and, why women wanted to be seen as equal to men. It's because they wished they were men. And Horney definitely disagreed with that and argued the opposite. So she argued that men had what she called womb envy, basically the unconscious jealousy over the fact that women are capable of creating life and being pregnant and bearing children, and that a lot of men's posturing, like men's need to be seen as better than women and men's need to be seen as more superior to women, actually comes from this womb envy, this feeling of inferiority that men have, that they can't create life the way a woman can, so they need to put women down. They need to kind of put women in their place to make themselves feel better. Just like penis envy, there is no scientific evidence that bears this out in any way. It's just kind of, Horney's opposing theory to penis envy. What she's more famous for is what we call the theory of neurotic needs. And your basic definition here is that all people are driven by a series of unconscious neuroses, and she called these your neurotic needs. So 2 examples would be like the need for love or the need for belonging. There were 10 of them total, and they all kind of follow that phrasing, the need for blank. And this unconscious need, or this unconscious neuroses, it was the driving force of our personality. You don't have a ton of room in your note guide to write down like all 10 neuroses, and nor do I want you to spend time memorizing all 10, but I do kind of want to show you an article that goes through it a little bit more in depth before we move on to the last part of our lecture here. So the same way that Freud created his defense mechanism theory to explain how humans cope with anxiety, the theory of neurotic needs was Horney's, version of that. It proposed that we used various neuroses to cope with anxiety, and that people tended to go to the same neuroses over and over again. So your neuroses can become like overused, which is what then makes them take on this appearance of being like a need for love, is because that's your go-to strategy to cope with anxiety all the time. She believed that they were split into 3 major categories. So these ones, the needs that move you towards others, needs that move you away from others, and needs that move you against others. So the ones that move you towards others are things like the need for love, the need for belonging, and they are correlated with personality traits like being needy or clingy, approval seeking, like needing a lot of affirmation from others, and to be told that your friends like you, and constantly being worried that you're being talked about or that your friends are upset with you or something. The needs that move you away from others tend to come across as more hostile, more aggressive, more rude, more suspicious, and tend to incorporate more antisocial behaviors. So these people are often described as like, suspicious, aggressive, indifferent, etc. And then the needs that move you against others are, really focused on like the need to dominate other people, the need to control people, so really needing to be in charge. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and just show you them. Well, I'm not going to go through them each one by one. The neurotic need for affection and approval, the neurotic need for a partner to take over your life, the neurotic need to restrict one's life within narrow borders, the neurotic need for power, the neurotic need to exploit others, the neurotic need for prestige, the neurotic need for admiration, for achievement, the neurotic need for self-sufficiency and independence, and the neurotic need for perfection. So each of them obviously is going to be correlated to specific traits according to Horney, and depending on which ones you fall back on is going to kind of determine your personality. I'll link this article along with the screencast in case you're interested in reading a little bit more about it.